What's happening, Captain? My name is Jared, and welcome to the Jared Show Knowledge Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the world we live in today. What a crazy, amazing time it is to be alive.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls,
The Jared Show. The Jared Show.
want to change the world.
It is an amazing time to be alive, isn't it? There's a lot going on. Actually, I have some exciting news of my own. I just launched my website. What up, though? I've got both podcasts on there. Some shirts you can buy, some merch, some amazing pictures I've taken over the years. I had printed on canvas, and soon to be much more. So much more. So yeah, I'm excited. But I'm also excited about all this wild stuff going on in the world. Call me crazy, and you wouldn't be the first. But I think everything that's going on right now is kind of exciting. Kind of like back in the 60s. You never know what's going to happen next. Actually, I want to talk about how now is a lot like the 60s. I also want to get to talk about how it's different. Very different. Way different. How our world is kind of weird, isn't it? How things are so much more different now than they ever have been in the history of the human race. And how things have just gotten kind of weird. I tell you what, let's get weird. In a groovy kind of way first, man. We'll jump back to the 60s when we get back. Can you dig it? Hi, my name is Svet Van Hardman III. I tell you about the Jared. He has show. He speaks, you listen. He shows, you watch. I watch every show. I listen every time. And you should too. Link, description, click. Svet out. Can you dig it? I knew that you could. I knew that you could. Welcome back, party people. It's time to get back to the 60s, or have we already? I used to love getting into the 60s. The music, the fashion, the hippie culture, the world-changing events, it was all so enthralling. You had protests and LSD, you had hippie culture and societal norms being reevaluated, communes and all kinds of different things. You had women's rights and racial rights and equality. You had war, Vietnam War. Fast forward to today in 2020 and there's protests, racial tension, more like publicized police brutality because of prejudice towards certain ethnicities. But you also have gender equality, the threat of war, at least, whether economically with, say, China, or dropping bombs like with North Korea. It's all here. There is even hippie culture, although it's not the way we usually think of when we think of hippies. But hippies really, even back in the 60s, really they just wanted to change the world. And they took LSD to change the way that they thought, not necessarily to get high. Most people took LSD, a mind-altering substance, back then to reach unto God, if you will. They really tried their best to expand their horizons, expand their mind. Later on in the 70s, that's where people took LSD just to get messed up and get high. But hippies, they did things like love-ins and sit-ins, and they protested a lot, especially the Vietnam War. Hippies were not lazy drug addicts that sat around all day and smoked weed or tripped out and said, man, after every sentence. They really weren't. If you go back and you look at hippie culture, like say Haight-Ashbury, and these types of places, they really worked hard. I mean, Haight-Ashbury, yeah, you could say that type of culture, that place in history at that particular time, a lot of hippies kind of took advantage of different situations and that kind of thing. But they really were trying to change the world, whether it be through music, whether it be through communes and different ways of existing on this earth. They did a lot of things, and they did everything with purpose. I mean, they did things like hitchhike across the United States just to get to a particular scene, like with Haight-Ashbury. They had a lot of purpose with what they were trying to do, to try to get to San Francisco or LA. And then eventually with Woodstock, which was in New York, people hitchhiked all the way back to the East Coast. They had purpose, and that purpose really was to change the world. And they wanted to change the world for the better. Now, did they succeed? I'm not necessarily sure. But I think it did change in certain aspects. And I think the 60s, with all the protests that they had going on and everything that they were trying to do, they were trying to peacefully get all these things accomplished. Eventually, these kind of things like at Kent State, these peaceful protests really erupted into violence through no part of the hippies and what they were trying to do. It really was the man or the establishment that took it to another level, because they just, those people just could not deal with the type of society that these hippies were trying to instate. They couldn't understand how we could live in that particular state of mind, where everything's free and these kind of things. You had communes where everybody worked together, and it was a lot like socialism. I'm going to get into different forms of government at some point: socialism, fascism, communism, oligarchy and monarch and all these kind of things, democracy and republic and all those. At some point, personally, I think we live under an oligarchy. You can look that up if you have time, but supposedly we're a democratic republic, which is interesting. But what these hippies were trying to do in the 60s was generally establish the best parts of somewhat of a socialist way of living, where really there are no leaders. There's you could say it was more of a democratic socialist existence. Now, some of those communes are still going. I think there's one probably still in Tennessee. I think up in Big Bear in California, I think there's something going to that effect. I've not checked into that. I need to. I thought about actually going to Big Bear one time, but never really made it. Probably don't need to anyway. I don't know as I'd fit in a commune, right? But, their intentions were good. What these hippies were really trying to do is not just lay around and smoke weed or smoke pot or, trip out on LSD. They were really trying to change the way that they thought, so that everything wasn't so polarized. Everything wasn't so us versus them kind of idea. And taking LSD and taking mind-altering drugs will give you the hint or the glimpse of oneness, the fact that we're all part of the human race and these kind of things. But, suffice it to say, it didn't really pan out. But the 60s was an interesting time. And I think, to me, 2020 is a lot like the 60s had a kid with the 90s. Right? Only he doesn't do drugs and he's way more uptight, man. I think we seem to have all the intensity and none of the chill from the 60s. I think there was a calming sense that it was inevitable that they would change the world. I think it was intense, but I don't think it was as anxious, right? I think we also inherited all the great entertainment of the 90s, right? You can think all the big blockbuster movies and all that kind of stuff. And, technology coming on and the dot-com bubble in the middle of the 90s and that kind of thing. I think we inherited all the great entertainment from the 90s, but it just doesn't seem as carefree, optimistic, happy, and wholesome. Obviously the biggest difference is technology, computers, cell phones, the interwebs that has just taken over our lives in really a very short amount of time. Think about it this way. Facebook was launched February 4th, 2004. Twitter, March 21st, 2006. And the first iPhone came out in June 29th, 2007. So, wow. Things have changed quite a bit since, 2004, right? I mean, people are obsessed with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and I know I'm obsessed with YouTube, and I'm getting more into podcasts and listening, especially as I'm trying to run and walk. I think there's benefits to what we have going on, but there's also obviously detriments. But now that we've gotten into the 60s a little bit, and we've gotten a bit weird, I want to zoom out on the timeline of history and see just how weird things really are. And we'll do that when we come back. Hey man, it's California Jimmy, man. I'm living the dream, man. Actually, it was the weirdest thing, man. I woke up today with this rad shirt on. And dude, I totally can't remember how I got it. So I called on my buddy Jack, and I was like, Johnson, man, don't be a dick, man, and tell me where I got this gnarly shirt from, bruh. And he was like, dude, you don't remember? We were listening to The Jared, and we went to TheJarredShow.com and scored all kinds of merch. And it showed up yesterday, so you wore it like all day, man. And I was like, whoa, yeah, I wonder what'll show up today, man. Welcome back, dudes and dudettes. Thanks for listening to this newfangled thing called a podcast, man. So, I tell you what, let's zoom out. I enjoy history. Like the song says, a bit of history repeating. And it truly is, apparently. But seriously, there's a lot to learn from history. With history, it's easier to explain things and even predict things. And I tell you what, I'm going to go out on a bold limb here and say something you might think is stupid, but I'm going to tell you what, every president from now until the end of time will claim that we are going to Mars. I guarantee you that. Guarantee it. You know why I know that? Because every president since the 60s has said the same thing. Every single one of them. And I tell you what, don't even get me started on the $61 million a day peoples over at Never a Straight Answer or NASA. We're not even going to go there. I'll do that some other time. Anyway, looking at history of the world, it's easy to get a good appreciation of the present, at least from a technological standpoint. Things like the radio, invented by Nikola Tesla in the 1890s, or cars, invented by a German man named Carl Benz in 1886. How about the television, which was developed by many different people during the late 19th and early 20th century? And how can we forget about the interwebs, invented in 1973, and it's attributed to Vinton Graykerf. I guess that's how you say his name. Technology is amazing, but more so in the areas of communication and transportation, the radio, the car, the television, the internet, and eventually things like planes and trains. Trains have been around for a long time, but the speed at which technology moves now, communication and transportation, is utterly astounding. What's even more astounding is how fast we absorb all of these new patterns in our lives and how we take for granted those new patterns within the human race. Things like if I'm trying to get from here to on the East Coast to California on the West Coast, how fast that is. It used to take a train, days or a week or something, or weeks. Now I can do that in the same day. I can wake up on the East Coast and go to sleep on the West Coast. For that matter, I can wake up today, get in a plane, go to England or somewhere overseas, in at least a day. I think it might take a day or two to get all the way around the world or whatever. It's amazing, and how fast we've incorporated all of these things into our lives. It kind of is a little weird, really. I don't think human beings have ever lived the way that we live right now. How fast we can communicate to everyone, and how we can absorb different cultures and different ideas, and how fast all of those cultures and ethnicities and all these things are merging together, really. 100 years ago, there started the Roaring Twenties. Like I said, I love history. And the Roaring Twenties was amazing. It was full of booze because of Prohibition, amazing music because of the emerging jazz scene. You had cars, which a lot of people, Henry Ford had put out, and all of a sudden there was mass production, and a lot more people had cars, and there was a lot of dancing. It was actually the start of one of the greatest decades in the United States. There's a lot going on in that decade. And we just come out of the Great War, or World War I. We were getting ready to go into the Second World War. Actually, we're getting ready to go into the Great Depression, starting in 1929. And then we got all of our socialist programs, Social Security, and all these kind of things happen in the 30s. And then towards the end of the 30s, after the New Deal had been established by one of the Roosevelts, we got into the Second World War, and then we came out of that smelling like a rose and being basically the superpower in the world. We had great economic prosperity. We went into the 50s. The 50s is what most people think of when they think of the good old days. We had suburbs and all these kind of things. Everybody had a job. Everybody had money. We had technology rolling in. New technology was coming out every single day. Things like dishwashers and microwaves, all these kind of things. And then eventually we had, the craziness of the 60s, the drug culture of the 70s, the excess of the 80s, a little bit of the 90s. And then we turned the page in the 2000s. And yeah, life has not really been the same since the 2000s, getting Facebook and Twitter and all these different things, especially the iPhone, has really changed the way that we do business. It's really changed the way that we communicate to each other. It's really changed the way that our world really works. With the interwebs coming into our lives in 1973, and really more around in the 80s is when a lot of people started getting more personal computers. I think 90s was a personal computer boom. I remember having a Gateway 2000 in the 90s. I think it was 97, 98. And that was crazy, jumping on AOL and hearing that little all that stuff to dial up and all that. Our world has, if you zoom out and you look at the through the lens of how technology has changed our day-to-day lives, things like instant everything, instant, in the microwave, in life, instant communication, instant money, instant everything. All you have to do is go back towards the 1800s, or the 19th century as they call it, and life is way, way, way different. It is interesting zooming out and getting a feel for how different the way that we live now is so much more different than it has been for thousands of years. And I'm not quite sure we as human beings have really figured out the best way to capitalize on all of this technology. I think slowly but surely we're starting to figure it out, but more slowly than surely. That's for sure. And yeah, the 20s was the start of a great decade, and here we are again, 2020. We're 100 years later. Do you think 2020 feels like it's the start of a great decade? I tell you what, we're going to have more on that when we come back. Hey there, just a quick message to remind you to hit that subscribe button and check out the other podcast, the Jared Show Wisdom podcast. While we have fun on this podcast, if you're looking for something that goes a bit deeper into the existential questions of life, go check it out. You can find both podcasts on my new website, TheJarredShow.com. I hope you'll join me in striving to live this life to its fullest and most meaningful by learning more. Welcome back, people of 2020. Stick with me here. I'm trying to find a positive in all this mess. Actually for me, it's not that hard to find a positive in 2020. 2020 has been somewhat the year of nostalgia for me. And looking back on things, learning from them. I've learned a lot this year. I'll actually get into 2020, the year of nostalgia, in the next episode. Next episode is going to be called Why I Think 2020 is Actually a Good Year. And I have a feeling I'm going to get some comments on that one. But for now, I want to think even further ahead than just Tuesday night, the next episode of the podcast. Thinking in the same terms as the people getting ready to go through the Roaring 20s. Okay? So, you got to remember, going through the Roaring 20s, you just got out of World War I. You just had Prohibition come in, so now you got out of World War I, the Great War, to end all wars, the way they looked at it, and all of a sudden now you can't drink. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in depth in the next episode. Just remember, that's the mind frame that those people are in going into the 20s or being in the early 20s. Prohibition and the Great War and all these kind of things. And it's interesting, so far I have not got into the mention of the bane of everybody's existence, the Rona V. I don't like to say its name. It's not my thing. And, right now feels like the uptight, brooding love child of all the bad parts between its parents, 1960s and 1990s. But check this out. Just like those people in the 20s, right? They didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know they were going to be part of the greatest decade and have some of the greatest music and jazz. They didn't know that, cars would be everywhere and business would be booming. They had no idea. And we don't know either. We don't know what's going to happen. It's a good question. Will we regain our sense of chill and roar with positive passions? Or will we continue down a dangerous road of fear, anger, destruction, and rinsing and repeating? Who knows? Right? Looking back in history, we can see what happened in the 60s. How things completely changed. The paradigm, the view that we had of the world. It drastically changed. We can look in the 20s and see how almost every decade, right? In the 1900s to the 1910s, you had the Federal Reserve come in. You had going into the Great War from the 10s to the 20s. You had a Great War. I think it was 1913, somewhere around there. Don't quote me on that, but I'm just spitballing. But then the 20s, you had Roaring 20s, Prohibition, but then you had gangsters coming in. You had all this kind of upheaval, people kind of secretly doing their own thing. The 30s was really all about getting back on track, going through the Great Depression in 1929, and the New Deal, And then, like I said, the 40s, 50s. Every decade has had its own thing going on, especially in the beginning of each decade. It's interesting how that seems to work. In the 2000s, right? We had Y2K and everybody's freaking out. All the computers, everything's going to shut down. What are we going to do? In 2010, we were just struggling to get back out of a Great Recession, if you will, in 2008. And there was a lot going on, and there still is. We're in 2020 now, and I really don't think we have enough information to say that this is a bad year. I mean, you got to remember, right? We're only halfway through the year. It's only what's today? August, right? It's only August. So, we've gone 6 months in? We're 7 months in? It's like, there's still a lot to go. And in the next episode, I'm going to try my hardest to convince you how 2020 is actually a good year. And I think I make a pretty good case for it. We're going to try it. I tell you what, personally, I prefer to look towards the past, gain a little insight, and let things ride. Bottom line here is, yeah, you can look at 2020 as a shitty year. I wouldn't blame you. We've had lockdown. We're watching jobs disappear. We got riots and bad cops, bad news, bad politics, and more still on the way. I don't think the Rona V is gonna go away, tomorrow. But here's the thing, man. Just remember, history repeating. We really don't know what's gonna happen. We don't know. I mean, we can make educated guesses based on patterns and algorithms and the ideas of what's gone on in the past and how those manipulate and really shape our, course and where we're going. But I don't think we can actually nail down and say, okay, well, this is what's going to happen. I think there's a certain freedom in that. I think for me, I try to look at it optimistically. And, if you think I'm being optimistic now, wait till you hear the next episode on Tuesday. In the next episode, we're going to get into why I think 2020 is actually a good year. Nostalgia, life lessons, and the roaring 20s. Oh my. It should be interesting. I hope you catch that one. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If so, subscribe for more. Also, don't forget about the other podcast, the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast, episode 3, coming out tomorrow night at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. Pacific. I always want to say specific, right? If you get some extra time on your hands, due to the old Rona V, go check out my new website, TheJarredShow.com. There you're going to find all my stuff. You're going to find links to Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, all the different places this podcast is on, Spotify and Pocket Cast and Google Plus and all kinds of different places. Yeah, go check it out. You'll actually even get to listen to some old shows if you want to. So go give it a shout out. See what you got going on over there. I thank you muchly for listening or watching this show. And as always, may God bless you.
The Jared Show.